on stage.
Thank you. Thank you. Awesome. Hello, my name is Marion. I think I never had a microphone working that well. I will be talking about threat detection, or actually most of my time how to not detect threats, or how threats will be hardly detected by security solutions that we have today. This first slide of my deck is the obligatory cat picture, which I was told that should be included in every conference talk these days. And when I came here, I was quite surprised that there was an entire talk about cats. It's news to me. However, how did I get this topic? This is the second most exciting slide of my deck. How did I come up with this topic? Like, so some time ago, I was sitting in my living room at home and working on a piece of malware and swearing a lot. And then there came my roommate, entered, and I told her that I was invited to talk at an event called Next Generation of Threats. And she looked at me like puzzled, asking me like, what do you want to talk about next generation of threats if you're not done with this one? This inspired me on threats that we have today and how to detect them, how they should be detected or not detected, actually. So let's get back in time. Can you read this? So this is not actually the living room of my grandma, but it looks like that. This is a slide representing the history of threat detection. Actually, detection systems that we have today, or let's say endpoint protection systems, most of them underlie a very principal flaw. And this flaw was built into these systems a long, long time ago, when the threats were really like singular. We all started like thinking about viruses somewhere in the 90s that would infect systems and spread slowly, because back then the internet was slow. And a little bit later there came Trojans, and after these there came worms, which would spread from computer to computer and bring their infections, stealing data and whatnot. And then someone, or actually before that, invented exploits, and then exploits were combined with malware to infect systems, and more data got stolen, and money was made. And at that point, when money entered the stage, all of a sudden we had not one or two threats anymore, but we had a boom. Back then we just had this singular threats. Back then the principle of malware detection on endpoint systems was invented. We were searching one file after another to see if we find any malicious activity or malicious signatures in there. And then all of a sudden systems had to be, we were facing this threat landscape that was all of a sudden way too much. But let's see how everything began for endpoint threat detection. Back in time, back in the 90s, these companies that were emerging were a big business because everyone wanted security on his computers, and the software that they would install on their endpoints would search for malicious files. Back then, there were so few malicious files that honestly, they could all be searched by file hashes. So there were businesses emerging at the end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s, offering solutions that would search for malicious files and systems using file hashes and updating their signatures. Seriously, this is no joke, distributed on floppy disks. This picture I actually grabbed from a page called obsoletemedia.org, because that's what it is. And if someone remembers, there's more obsolete media that was used back then to distribute these signatures. Back then everyone talked about detection, like signatures, detections of malicious files. There were file hashes. Later on, they used the principle of patterns, so you tried to optimize speed by not searching for particular files, because files were too many after some time, but you tried to search for signatures inside of these files. Namely, you wanted a signature that would define the malicious attributes of a file that you were searching for on a machine. So the whole process was optimized. Of course, a lot of things changed. Now in 2014, we have a lot of very sophisticated means of searching for patterns. In the beginning, of course, there were the file checksums, the hashes. Later on, we used byte patterns to identify files that had different hashes but were actually doing the same thing or were presenting the same malicious virus or malicious software. Later on, when threat actors figured out how to destroy these patterns, we started building behavior patterns to represent not the bytes in the file, but the behavior of the file that we identified as malicious, and tried to put this into patterns. Later on, we combined all the different patterns that we had to create static and dynamic heuristics to estimate the maliciousness of a file. We even tried whitelisting and searching for all sorts of patterns in network streams and putting it all into the cloud, of course, to have more automation and be better in detection and show more performance. But well, this list, I have to tell you, is not the entire list of capabilities of endpoint threat detection systems. I can't tell you what specialties every vendor has in the software or what everyone's trying, but the basic flaw that I would identify in there is that they're all searching for patterns. Every endpoint detection system or endpoint protection system is going to search for something that it can identify as malicious, but therefore these malicious attributes have to be known. You're searching for a malicious behavior, you're searching for malicious URLs, you're searching for byte patterns that identify some binary as malicious. But for finding something like that, you have to know before what you're searching for and how to find it. However, a lot of things have changed, I told you before, but what has changed mostly in this business, what I personally love the most is the definitions. So here we have a lot of buzzwords that were used back then, the 90s or in 2000s, and nowadays we changed a lot of all of them, which are now the very well-known buzzwords which we use in our research and in marketing. Actually, I didn't tell you before, I spent some years of my career working for an antivirus vendor. I personally believe that no researcher ever getting in touch with antivirus vendors will be a side of marketing, because we all do our research to represent our company and represent the products that the company is selling. And well, that's what it is, a business. Every company that's out there has a business model. Most of them work on their business model as for selling a product. And that's exactly what the security vendors do. They produce products that aim at protecting their customers, but in the end, they also have a business model and try to sell their products. So they need the right representation. But the core of this slide, or what I want to tell you here, is that there's always a core in every protection solution or every security solution that remains the same, while the names are changing like on a yearly basis. So all these vendors that I was talking about before, they exist for like 20 years or 25 years, and be sure that every code repository that they use, there might be a piece of code in that has been there for 20 years and has been changed. So you can kind of grasp that also the basic principles that these repositories are built on carry one or another flaw. So what do these endpoint security solutions actually do? I told you they're all searching for patterns. They implement one or another system driver, they implement one or another scanning platform or a management system which is managing the scan engines, which then try to search for maliciousness in files, which try to scan for URLs in network streams, which try to scan email attachments if they're binary, if they're executable, and if they're malicious. They try to find patterns that indicate an exploit, which is appended to an email. They try to scan third-party media. They try to assure security of devices you connect to your computer. And they try to monitor system behavior if they can find malicious patterns. But they're just still all searching for patterns. So now we talk about next generation of threats. We search for patterns that we haven't known before, because there's new threats out there. They dress up in a new fashion every time they try to hit a computer system. And if there's no recognizable pattern in a file, in an ad tag, in an email, in whatever is being scanned, legacy threat protection will not going to be able to detect anything in there, because it can't recognize a known pattern. But on the other hand, thank God that most threats aren't that smart either. This screenshot I made from a string search from a malicious binary, and if you can read this, it tells AV, please add the string to your signatures. And back then at the enterprise company, of course, we were happy to do that and detect that binary used by that string. But sadly, not all malware provides this easy way. So for today, for showing how threat detection works or how it could be improved, I provided 4 case studies of malware, which was really not easy to detect and still provides problems for security solutions. First of all, SUSE, my personal favorite malware family. Is anyone in here who's never heard about the SUSE Trojan? Who was affected by a SUSE Trojan ever before? One? Can hardly believe that. SUSE is one of the most notorious banking Trojans. Actually, it's not a banking Trojan anymore. It's like a multifunctional, multi-platform malware which can be tweaked in any direction and can be added functionality and can be added protection, can be added anti-detection. This mainly or also because the sources of the SUSE were leaked some years ago. Back then, all the other sorts of malware authors grabbed the code and used it happily, because SUSE is actually one of the most sophisticated malwares out there. I love all of the blogs on targeted attacks and how sophisticated software was used to breach some system, but most of the malware used in targeted attacks is not as sophisticated as this malware. SUSE implements a lot of evasion techniques which help him to stay undetected on the system, remain on the system even when its binaries are removed, and update itself in a regular circle to evade in the future. Here are some different variations of the SUSE Trojan that we deal with today, but actually I can promise you they're all based on the same principle. As I told you, SUSE is the most notorious banking Trojan that we have out there and implements a lot of evasion techniques, which you can see if you watch the SUSE tracker. This is a platform tracking SUSE binaries that were found in the wild and actually comparing it with the current detection of antivirus solutions and saying that you have like a constant detection rate of about 40%. Now, this is actually very low. This is a false negative of 60% of malware. This is not like a one-day measure that I'm showing here. This is like a constant thing. SUSE is a master of evasion. What it does is, for understanding the evasion or the static evasion of detection, you have to understand the principle of searching the patterns in the binary. For detecting a binary, an antivirus solution has to find something that gives it a hint that this is a malicious binary, which in most cases would be either a file hash, because the file has been known before, or a byte pattern that indicates the specific malware family. Now, if there's no byte pattern to be found because the pattern was destroyed in some way, or if the file is a fresh sample and hasn't been known before, there's no chance for antivirus to detect the sample. So, SUSE actually was one of the families doing most for crypting itself or destroying patterns. We like to call this weapons of match destruction. So what SUSE is good at, what actually most malware today is good at is destroying these kind of patterns that antivirus solutions search for. They use cryptors and code obfuscators and runtime packers and whatnot to have one and the same binary appear with different faces in a different form every time it is remodeled, it is encrypted. And this makes it very hard to find one byte pattern that identifies all of them. So the dream of us for detecting malware will be that there's a 6 to 10 byte pattern in every single SUSE binary, which identifies it as SUSE and tells us it's malicious. And while SUSE is a master in destroying these patterns, I told you. However, if it infects a system, it will always take the same steps. It will always do the same malicious things, which I listed up here on the slide. It drops an executable, it deletes the original dropper, it will care for persistence in one or the other way, it will create a registry key, which assures it's loaded on every time the system boots. It will inject some payload in the system process, and it will get a configuration file, which tells it what to do on the infected system. This is pretty much always the same. Some variants do a little bit of different stuff, but honestly, none of the hackers that copied the code of the original SUSE put a lot of work in to have it really look different. They all use the same file name creation algorithms. They all look the same fashion. Pretty much all of them use this registry key for persistence, which looks the same fashion. All of them, really all of them, download the configuration file to tell them what to do. So if you're searching for a pattern, don't tell me in this activity you don't see any pattern, if it's always the same. However, SUS is one of the most persistent malwares I've ever seen, because in principle, it is invisible when running on the machine. This principle of SUS is indeed more sophisticated than most other malwares I've seen so far. It will be loaded at boot time and load a DLL, which is on the system, and inject it into a system process, which is explorer.exe or services.exe, which, if you understand a bit of Windows, can't be stopped at runtime. So the binary is actually staying inside or in the context of this process for all the time the system is running and can't be removed. So while this is happening, SUS is actually able to protect its binaries on the disk. So the Trojan is running, you can't kill it, you can delete the binaries which are on disk, but then you would have to count with the running Trojan in the context of the system process to restore its binaries, to download a new DLL, to download a new infector, and just restore the state that it had before, and just load again on the next boot time. So this is why it is actually really hard to remove from the system, especially for an antivirus program. And the other principle that I think is very sophisticated is the evasion technique that it shows, as it is updating itself in a regular term. This is another principle that has to be known about antivirus solutions. As I showed you before, the floppy disk, there was a signature update back in the 90s. Today, these are a little bit faster. Today, the update process is still the same thing. Like, antivirus industry creates signatures, calculates hashes from fresh known malware, and pushes these updates out to their customers. This happens like every 1 to 5 hours. So if they find a new malicious binary, it takes a maximum of like 5 hours to have the signature for this binary on the customer side. Now, what you have to do, if you have a system infected and have a binary on there, and you're scared it's going to be detected in the future, everything you have to do to evade is like update it on a regular basis to evade this signature update process. What you see on this slide is a list of archives, a list of directories that we found on a SUS-infected platform a while ago, which would update its configuration file and its binary every few days. Every few days, you're not sure to evade any detection or to evade the updates, but you have a high likely chance that within this like weekly update circle, the antivirus vendor or the antivirus solution which is installed on the machine won't be able to detect the binary. So if you update regularly and push fresh binaries to the machine, you have a very good chance to actually evade this signature update process. So what do you do with this binary? Well, as I showed you before, SUS shows a pattern. It shows the same activities all over. It's just hard for an antivirus to actually detect these patterns. There's connections between binaries. If you want to detect a SUS in the system, or if I want to check if a system is infected, I see if I can find the persistence registry key. I see if I can find the file names in the application directory. These file names, if I check back here, there is a pattern in there, right? You can see they're similar. They're nonsense, but as a human, you can recognize these are like not usual directories. So if you take into account these file names and maybe a domain generation algorithm, the domain names that the SUS binary connects to, you can create a bigger picture. And if you actually have visibility on all these parts, you can very well detect if a machine is infected with a SUS. If you just don't focus on one binary after another, but try to see the big picture. All right, second scenario, armoring. SUS has its own techniques of evading, but there's also malware, which is actually really focusing on being hard to detect and hard to analyze. We had a case of Sesura a while ago, which really tried to just evade everything. It had various layers of encryption, or various packer layers, which would totally evade any static detection, because again, there's no byte pattern to find in there anymore. And it would also try to trick any kind of emulation or simulation. Usual endpoint detection systems today, they use on-the-fly runtime simulation. They incorporate emulators which try to emulate the file at runtime and see if they can grab behavior patterns by simulating the file. So if the sample is encrypted and destroys any behavior pattern too, there's no pattern to find on that file, right? So we had the sample in our lab, and the first thing I would do is search for mouse activity. A lot of sandboxes, which are now today, you can submit your sample and see what it does. They're prepared for this, but the emulators, which you have in your endpoint protection, which you have in your antivirus, most of them will not recognize this. And if they do, they actually get headache with the following two tricks. This is actually, this was a pretty evil trick where the sample would check for the current date or would do time-based execution. So it would wait for a specific point in time until it would show activity in the system. Otherwise, it would just loop forever. On this check, you can see here that it was specifically waiting for the days 16, 17, or 18 of any month. So we just only check for the day and would only be able to run on 3 specific days in a month. And I tried to find a sandbox which actually has the right date configured there. This is funny in our lab because we got this sample and we had a valid sandbox trace, which were really happy and looking at it and seeing how the sample was protected from analysis. And the next day after, we tried to put it into the same sandbox and we got different results. And if you're working in IT, you know how hard it is to have unpredictable behavior from a binary or a machine. We were thrilled back then. However, there's a third trick that I want to show you today, which is pretty easy. These are just 3 of the bunch of tricks that Sura presented us with, and this one would check if the underlying machine where it was executed was actually real hardware or a virtualized system. This is a really easy check where the hard disk identifier is looked at if it equals some part of a string which identifies it as VirtualBox or QEMU or VMware. And another check if there's the sandbox DLL, if it's possible to load this DLL inside of the system where the malware is running. This is something which you won't find on a real system, ever, but you might find it in a virtualized environment if the environment is not prepared. And for sure, you will find one of these indicators in the emulation engines of an antivirus system. So what I want to tell you is that there's always a hint. If malware is not running on a real system, but on a sandbox, there's always a possibility to find that out. These are just 3 of the many tricks that there's possible. So what do you do with a sample like that? I would again advise you to get back to the bigger picture, to look for suspiciousness on a binary. If it won't run in an emulator or in any sandbox, if you can't find anything on it that's suspicious enough for me to raise the levels. If you have very speckle layers, you won't find any static patterns in there. And the sample, for sure, you won't be happy executing it in a sandbox because you always have to wait for the 16th, 17th, or 18th of any month. So what I would advise you here is to look at the bigger picture and especially the way of infection and the activity that the binary is later on exhibiting on the system. But therefore, you would need to know what your system in a normal state will be doing. And we'll be talking about this later, about system baselining, to see how binaries affect the system and what differences they produce there and how these can be identified as malicious. All right, case study number 4, exploitation. Actually, this is about exploits, but you have no idea how hard it is to find a picture with a Lego guy that relates somehow to exploits. So I named it exploitation. Anyway, there's some simple mathematics behind exploits and antivirus systems and in general security solutions. An exploit is not naturally the same thing as a piece of malware. First of all, you have to identify what's an exploit versus what's a vulnerability. When you have a vulnerability in your system, that means there's sort of an open hole in the software that can be used by an exploit to gain control of the specific application or later on over this dedicated system. But honestly, there's no solution on this planet that will protect you from vulnerable software. So if the software that you have installed in your machine has a 0-day vulnerability, There's very few that you can do to stop an attacker from using this vulnerability to intrude your system. The problem with the exploits themselves, let's assume they're known exploits. These exploits are very evasive because they also know very well how to hide their patterns. As I told you before, legacy endpoint protection is searching for patterns. It's searching for something that identifies an intruder or an attacker as evil. An exploit, naturally, is very good in hiding its evilness. But let's have a closer look at how exploits work on the system, or how an actual drive-by works in the system. This might be the third most exciting slide of my deck, where we see a typical drive-by infection, which are like the different steps the infection takes until it delivers an exploit to a system, detonates it, and gains control over the system. I did it a little bit easier for you to actually follow this drive-by. So, sorry, what you had there, this is like the different steps. You have different hops. This is a very important thing we're gonna get to pretty soon. In the first step, you have some website. In this case, this was an online magazine, which was compromised, or the web server of this magazine was compromised, and a piece of malicious JavaScript was placed on this web server and would be loaded with the magazine website every time a visitor opened the website. And this malicious JavaScript on there was actually pretty simple. It would check if there was a Windows machine surfing to that site, if there was an Internet Explorer surfing to that site. And based on that information, it would decrypt a second URL and append the parameter. You can see the parameter here. It's marked in yellow. This indicates there's an Internet Explorer running on there. Then in the third hop, there was another check built in to see which version of the Internet Explorer was surfing to that website, appending another parameter to the next request, to another URL that was decrypted, and eventually ending up with this piece of code where the final exploit delivering domain was resolved, was deobfuscated, appending a string that would request I think it was a flash exploit. Never mind. This URL would deliver the final exploit. You can see down there in the script, like you can recognize there's a domain down there, right? It's like these three parts and then the string in front and the second string. This was decoded at runtime by the script to result in the domain you can see up there, the dynami.ru. And this domain, this server located there, would then deliver the exploit. You can see down there, there's a ROT13 deobfuscation decryption. Let's stick with the deobfuscation. That would finally produce the final URL. And you can imagine if there's ROT13, there could be anything, any string concatenation, any kind of deobfuscation that would produce the final domain. And then you have a look at all of these desperate antivirus engineers and analysts who try to create a pattern which could match this kind of URL. So let's assume they know this URL is malicious. They know this domain is prone to deliver exploits to systems, and we create a pattern for this. But the problem here is that JavaScript is actually really, really good in obfuscating strings. It's awesome. It's incredible what a web browser nowadays can interpret. What bullshit you can deliver, where the web browser still executes it and produces readable text, readable ST, that is then resolved to URL. All right, so you see finally this was the last step, that was the exploit delivered. One question I was asked also by my flatmate, like what's better than a ROT13? No one knows it's double ROT13. I had to think about it for a while, I admit. So this is the final payload, let's call it. This is the kind of exploit that was delivered as a JavaScript, which would then exploit an Internet Explorer use after free vulnerability. Don't ask me which one it was. But you can see this is like a JavaScript which can be modified in any way. So if you want to destroy patterns, you can add blanks, as many as you want in JavaScript. It will still execute. You can encode any shit that you send to a web browser. The web browser will still interpret it. But the threat detection systems that search for patterns will have an impossible job in creating signatures or using file hashes to detect this kind of malware. And even better, there's exploits that are more sneaky, because if you look here, this is still a file that's eventually dumped on the hard disk, but if you take a sneaky exploit, like one that was detected in this spring, I think around May, the CVE 2014-1776, which would not produce any file on the disk, but execute the exploit on the fly. I was amazed. This is just great. And it's impossible to create any kind of signature in there. The scripts that I'm showing you here is like on the top you can see a very long string, which is the initially encoded exploit, which is then sent over to a function which does a decode on it, which decodes that string to an almost valid exploit and sends it to the external interface of the flash on the system to execute it. It's just very beautiful because the bottom box you see there, that's the exploit. It is never seen by any antivirus. It can't be seen because it's no file. Okay, what do you do about exploits? I see my time is running out. There's actually no silver bullet. I told you you can't protect the vulnerable system accordingly. You can add up every other security measure that you have, but you're not able to protect the vulnerable software itself, if not with a patch from the vendor that helps you patch this hole in the solution. But what you can do is actually watch out for the general security of the system, because something is also always true, an exploit will never come alone. An exploit is not the malware, which is actually stealing data from your machine. It's the way for the intruder to get in. So if you actually have system in place to either detect the malware that's coming after, or to teach your employees to not click on malicious links or not open attachments to trigger an exploit, you might be safer from the exploit, which is actually enabling the whole attack. All right, so much about exploits. The last case study, crooks will always be where the money is. I think I heard this today in some other presentation also. If there's money somewhere, there will be hackers coming. It's even more sad that some companies today are not prepared for this principle at all. So this is a case study of some targeted attack malware, which I actually have to say was some of the simplest malware that I've ever seen in my career. So I have to assume these companies were tricked by simplicity of an attack. And the amazing thing is, like, in security, we now adopted the breach parade because it works and it works again and it works again and it still works. Writing targeted malware for a specific attack, which actually can't be detected by security solutions nowadays, because if they don't exhibit any pattern that can be detected, they can evade anything. All right, how does it work? Like, this case study is focusing on Black Pus, which was the malware which breached the target point-of-sale systems and stolen around, I think, 40 million records of credit card data, which is pretty cool. I don't know what you get nowadays in money for credit card data on the market. When I was a kid, it was $10, then it was $1, now it might be 50 cents, or whatever. 40 million is a lot of money. 40 million is a lot of data which you can monetize into a lot of money. However, how did it work? Like, Blackpast was really simple. There were two components installed in the target system, which was one server component, aggregating all the data that the point-of-sale system component would report. So the point-of-sale system were infected with a piece of malware, which would grab the credit card data from the memory of the point-of-sale systems and send this data to a centralized component on the network, which was still inside of target. So there were two different pieces of software, aggregating data, collecting it, and then sending it out to a server in the United States. So there was a server in Los Angeles actually waiting for this data and then sending it over to Russia. I think the original Etika was from the Ukraine or somewhere there, but the servers were located in Russia. Now, what is the genius thing about this attack is that it's so simple. By being so simple, the guy flew under the radar of any security solution out there. And any alerts that were generated by a security solution were not heavy enough, were not important enough for the security team to take care of them. So this attack was ongoing for a month, and if the guy got away with his hack, he might actually be done for a lifetime with working with all the money he made. However, there was so much data exfiltrated, and as I told you, the tools used for this hack were really simple. We analyzed the malware in there, and were two people being done in a day because they were so obviously simply implemented. It would implement a service on the Windows machine that was running on the POS system, And the servers would just operate there and search the memory for card data and push the card data out. And the other component was also a service which should just aggregate the data, collect it all together, and push it outside of the network. So what I'm showing here is the only anti-analysis trick that we found in there, which was some string obfuscation of strings inside of the binary, which were hard-coded, but couldn't be seen statically. We had to run it once to actually see what the sample would do on the system. It was like the easiest job we ever had. So with this hack, we can see that simplicity kills. If you have security solutions which search for malicious activity and they can't find any malicious activity, they won't trigger any alert. Blackbox is like a very simple thing, but tailored for this specific attack. It would incorporate hard-coded IP addresses and server names. It would use username and password that were created by the attacker on the hacked server machine. It would not clean any traces of infection on the machine, so the dropper would always remain in the directory where it would be started from. And the most obvious sign for a non-experienced malware author was that the guy actually didn't strip his debug path from the binary. What happened then, if you put the binary into the debugger, it would actually show you the name of the malware author. This is very bad operational security, but bear in mind, the guy still stole 40 million credit card numbers, and is probably either in jail or pretty rich at this moment. So this is one of the most representative targeted attacks that we saw the past year, and I heard in the beginning that people are really scared of targeted attacks. What you can do out there, your antivirus is not going to protect you from anything that's built to evade antivirus. Be sure that there's enough viruses out there that are not built to evade and they're going to be caught by your security solutions, which is like the big mass, but targeted attacks will be prone to evade any antivirus solution that you have. And what you can do there is raise the levels of the general security in your network. Like how we saw with these POS terminals. There is honestly POS terminals that are connected to the internet and able to build FTP connections and able to push data out of a network. Like this is things that these dedicated systems shouldn't be able to do. Security professionals are all agree on this, but actually I'm pretty sure there's still devices connected to networks where they shouldn't be connected. So I would advise to minimize the attack surface that these systems have, cut them down on services, cut them down on abilities. I mean, this is something I learned at university, which was a long time ago, and this attack just showed me that this is not a common principle. This is still happening today, that the POS terminal, as some other researcher said, in Alabama is able to do Facebook. It's just something you don't do. Another principle there is to keep track of your intellectual property and the important data that you aggregate and not exhibit it to the outside world. So if you do transactions with like about 40 or 50 millions of credit cards, you might want to have special security to keep the data safe. All right, so these were my case studies. Now let me try to wrap it all up into a single message. What I've been ranting about here is like that antivirus as it is doesn't work, which is not true. I personally don't think antivirus is dead, and I personally think everyone should still care about this antivirus system on the computer, just it does not protect you from stuff that's built to evade. What it does is it still keeps you safe from the other 80% of crap which is floating around the internet, all the unsophisticated attacks that antivirus systems can still catch. And this is actually not wisdom that comes from me, but from a very security dedicated guy that I personally respect a lot. His name is Bruce Schneier. This quote I grabbed from his blog, and I actually think he has a right point there. But what you can do now for defending yourself against the other 20% that are targeting you is to have a broader visibility in your system, to see what's going on, to monitor the activity, to monitor outside connections of your network, to monitor inbound connections of your network, to monitor your intellectual property, to know where it resides, and to keep track of it so it doesn't leave your company network or personal computer for that reason. What has been coined some years ago was the infection kill chain. That's why I'm asking here, are you ready to kill? Do you have like the visibility of all the different steps an attacker has to take to exfiltrate data from your network? Because this is not a singular thing which is happening. There has to be someone doing something wrong. There has to be a security flaw, or there has to be an employee clicking on the wrong link or executing an email attachment. Then there has to be some exploit happening. There has to be some way the attacker can actually intrude your system, or is exploiting an application, or stealing a password from an employee, or whatever means it takes for him to get into the network. Then next step is he has to infect the system. This is a place where an antivirus can be very useful to actually detect known malware or known malicious tools which could reside in the system. The next step would be for an infected computer to call outside of the network, to build outbound connections, which is something that a lot of perimeter security solutions don't watch if there's something from the network trying to get outside. And in the fifth point, the malicious actor has always has to be able to steal data from your system. This is a point where I would advise anyone to just use as much encryption as you can, because before there was like this this interesting case of Finn Fisher. I think Morgan talked about it. It's an incredibly awful tool. I'm totally no fan of the business. But well, they were victims of a data breach like some months ago, and incredibly enough, they had all their data encrypted. So some hacker exfiltrated 40 gigabytes of intellectual property from their business. And up to today, people are not able to read the data which is exfiltrated because it's all encrypted. Which is great operational security, I have to say. All right, this was my talk. I thank you very much for your attention. And if there's any questions, or if there's time for questions, I can answer them later.